All right, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. It is 12 o'clock by my watch in Chicago, so it's time to begin. Thank you for attending this PowerCast, The Rise of Single Sign-On by John Vanderwall, Carol Woodbury, and Pat Botz, all of HelpSystems. This PowerCast is sponsored by HelpSystems. My name is Ian Cartwright. I'm Education Manager for Common, and I appear on your screen as webcast host. If you experience any technical issues during the presentation, you can send me a chat message using the chat box, which is on the bottom of the screen. If you would like to send written questions to the presenter during the presentation, use the Q&A area, also on the bottom of the screen, and select the send to all panelists. Carol, John, and Pat will answer your questions at the end of the presentation as time permits. What I'm going to do now is hand the ball over to John, and John is going to take control and introduce everybody to our panel. John, go ahead.
Again, this is John Vanderwall. I am the Vice President and Business Unit Manager for Security Services for the IBM here at HelpSystems. With me today is Carol Woodbury and Pat Botz. Carol Woodbury is the VP of Global Security Services and the technical lead on my team. Carol has a number of designations, as you can see behind her name: CISSP, CRISC, and PCIP. I don't know what each one of those specifically means. But there's a lot of C's and S's, and it means that she knows a lot about security. Pat has a master's in security and computer science, and he's a senior security consultant on our team. And he is also a veteran of IBM and has spent a lot of time working on single sign-on, and I always refer to him as the modern father of something called EIM, which we'll get to later in this presentation. So we decided that a good thing to educate the IBMI public about is the rise of single sign-on. We've been seeing an awful lot of interest in this particular topic here at HelpSystems, and it basically is a way that you can start to scrap passwords. So probably all wondering what that means. So I'm going to go ahead and start this presentation and turn this over to Carol. Carol, would you guide us through what you see here? And Pat, again, if you have anything that you want to add to this, I'll turn it over to you at the end. But Carol, go ahead.
Thanks, John. Yes, as you were saying, we are seeing a lot of questions and interest in the single sign-on. And so I think this chart kind of describes the problem. So you have one person, John Smith, and John has many different user IDs associated with himself. So you have the one that you sign on initially with Windows, and then you have one or more associated with whatever IBMI partitions you're signing on to. You may have one associated with applications. Maybe they're running WebSphere. Maybe you're doing some other type of Apache web. And then you have your Windows 80 accounts that you have to deal with. If you're running anything with AIX or Windows or Linux, so many accounts and then so many passwords associated with that. The problem with, you have to keep track of all the account names as well as their passwords. And so it's just become quite overwhelming. And I think that that's probably why we have seen so much interest in single sign-on.
Pat, did you want to add anything here, or should I just keep going?
One of the things that is I find interesting about this is that if you have, say, 10 users in your organization, I'm trying to make sure I can do the math here, and each of those users has 3 passwords that are defined, or 3 user IDs that are defined in 3 different places, then you're actually managing 30 different people, because there are 30 separate user IDs and passwords that have to be managed by somebody. And so multiple IDs and passwords is like a multiplier for the actual number of people, in air quotes, that you support.
Very good point. Thanks, Pat. So let's talk about some of the real questions that we ran across with SSO as we hear about it here at HelpSystems. How do you simplify authentication for end users? Authentication is providing you who you are and what you say you are, typically accomplished by entering a user ID and password combination. So Carol, Give us your thoughts on simplifying authentication.
Well, again, it goes back to that previous chart where you have, and what Pat was saying about multiplying the number of systems and the number of IDs, and you're actually multiplying all of that authentication requirement across all of those systems. And the real issue is managing that. So how do you, both from an administrator profile or administrator perspective, as well as an end user perspective, administer that, and how do you simplify that? So the idea is that what we're hearing is that most people want to use one login, and most people want to use their Active Directory ID and have that be the profile or account of choice across their entire organization. So the question is, how does one do that?
Pat, thoughts?
And I would again sort of double down on that and say that the problem really isn't with authentication. The productivity impact isn't the time spent typing an ID and password into a prompt. The problem is really the time that's spent either when you don't know the right password or when you enter the wrong one often enough, and now you have to also involve a help desk and get something reset. And then once every typically 90 days, you have to go out and you have to try and reset all of your passwords. And hopefully your password composition rules can be the same, so you can have the same one everywhere. That makes it a little bit simpler, but in many cases that's not the case. So it's, as Carol said, it's really the time spent in managing those passwords that is so costly.
Perfect. Thank you, Pat. And so the real problem that we've seen here is just managing passwords and all the, as Pat explained earlier, the exponential nature of that, where the number of passwords and combinations you need to know seems to grow. So let's go ahead and look at some common solutions. Let's look at some options for making things easier for the end user. Pat, why don't you take this one and start talking about, some of the different products that are out there, and just kind of give us an introduction of, all the different ways that we can, deal with this whole issue of profiles and authentication and getting access to what we need to get access to.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So, one of the ways people have tried to address this problem is with user provisioning. And user provisioning is something that centralized that allows you to create a user description in a centralized tool, and it goes out and it creates the user ID. And many of them also let you change passwords manually. Now, one of the issues with that is that anytime you're synchronizing passwords, you also face the prospect of them getting out of sync for one reason or another. The user is sure they changed it in both places, but perhaps they didn't. Maybe a system was restored, and the passwords don't match up, or any number of reasons why the passwords become out of sync. And once again, as soon as they get out of sync, that's where the cost is involved with dealing with that. And no, it's not just the end user, it's also an administrator. Another way that people would like to have things work is they would like to use Active Directory and then use LDAP and point at LDAP and just have LDAP synchronize the ID and password that is provided. And that works for some platforms, but certainly not for the IBM I. And a lot of times the problem is that the user IDs are the same. And so if you are authenticating to Active Directory, what user profile in the IBMI represents the same person that just authenticated. And then there are any number of password synchronization products, and that's probably the primary way that people choose to address this problem. And again, that has all of the issues related to as soon as you synchronize them, forces start to work on trying to make sure that they are not synchronized anymore. And again, that becomes costly when you have to get system administrators involved to fix the problem. What all of these have in common is, these approaches have in common is they still depend on providing passwords at every system. And that's also what makes them, that's also their weakness.
Mm-hmm. Carol, what is the problem with passwords?
So the problem with passwords is that end users have to remember them. I mean, not just end users, administrators and everybody in between has to remember them. And I don't know about you, but when I go get that message that says, hey, your password is expiring in 7 days, do you want to change it now? If it's a Friday, no way am I going to change that. I'm going to wait until Monday so that I have a chance of remembering it the next day. Because if I don't remember it, then I've had to either call help desk or go through some sort of password self-help to get it reset, and then I have a new password, or people write it down. And that's where most people end up, is that they write it down. And part of that is compounded with the fact that some organizations don't allow passwords to be the same on different systems. And honestly, that's best practice that you change them. So again, that multiplier factor. And just the fact that passwords have to be remembered when somebody forgets. And so that's the real issue here with passwords. The other thing is that passwords flowing around a network are vulnerable. A lot of people have not taken the time to do encrypted sessions internally. Well, that's best practice. A lot of people haven't done that. So anytime you're going to sign on to IBMI, whether it's through a 5250 session, or maybe you're doing something with ODBC or FTP, all of those are flowing in clear text if you're not running over an encrypted session. So if you look at how people have been able to get into organizations and penetrate organizations, one of the things they want to do is to scrape off, they'll put listeners around the network, and they'll scrape off the user IDs and passwords, and they will use those to attack other servers and get information from those databases. So passwords in and of themselves can be quite vulnerable.
And Carol, one thing that I used to run into from time to time when I was having to manage passwords across multiple IBMI systems at a former employer was that I would be sure that I hadn't changed my password on one or more of the systems when I actually had. Then I would disable the password or the profile because I thought it was the old one, when in fact I had changed it. So when I was able to reset it, I couldn't set it to be the same as all the rest of them because I'd actually already used that on that one system. And that was always a nightmare.
Well, that, and as you had said before, a lot of times different rules are in effect. So you may have one set of rules on your network for your Active Directory, but yet have a different set of rules on IBMI or on, within an application. And so it just compounds the issue.
Mm-hmm.
So let's, we've talked a lot about passwords here, which is really the issue that we're trying to overcome, and all of the problems that Pat and Carol have talked about when it comes to passwords. So if not passwords, what should we be doing? So I'm going to hit page down one more time here. And Pat, you want to talk a bit about the Kerberos protocol and kind of set the stage for how we're going to look at single sign-on?
Sure. So there's a different authentication protocol, different from user ID and password, called Kerberos, and it's got a lot of attributes that are very useful in this distributed computing environment that we're in. In fact, it was designed at MIT, and it was defined for the environments that we are all working in today. The solution they came up with is based on tickets. So you prove your identity to a trusted third party, which is the Active Directory, or really the domain controller. And the domain controller issues you a ticket, and that ticket has information about who you are in it, and it's got some other stuff in there that protects it against replay attacks and other things. But what it doesn't have in it is a password. And you can use this protocol so that once you are authenticated to the network, you can essentially sign in to any other service on the network using that ticket. And what the service does is they verify that the ticket was really generated by the trusted third party, by the domain controller. And it does all of this through encryption, but not by passing passwords around. And therefore, it allows a service to ascertain what your network ID is, regardless of whether it's a Windows workstation or an IBM I or some other platform. The most important thing about Kerberos is, whether you're aware of it or not, Kerberos is the authentication protocol whenever you log in to a Windows domain. So the vast majority of our customers and of Windows networks are already using this Kerberos thing, so it makes sense to take advantage of it wherever you can.
Thanks, Pat. I advanced the slide here just because what you were talking about, it kind of talks about the Kerberos ticket and whatnot. Carol, can you talk a little bit about the lower right-hand corner? It talks about, when you're using the Kerberos authentication, the profile can be set to password star none on an IBM I, which to me, I think, we need to explore that a little bit to, learn more about what that means, the effect on the IBM I, and anything else you'd love to talk about here. So go ahead, Carol.
Right. So the beauty of using Kerberos, as Pat was saying, it allows you to authenticate. So what is authentication? It's proving that you are who you say you are. And so you can do that through a variety of methods, but it does not require a password. So a password is just one method of authenticating. So as Pat was explaining about the Kerberos ticket, it allows the service to say, yeah, I've authenticated. This person has been authenticated, but nowhere in that ticket is a password. So when you're actually using this Kerberos ticket and presenting it to IBM I for sign-on, there's no password in there. And so guess what? You can actually set the password in the IBM I user profile to star none, because it's not being used. It's the Kerberos ticket that does the authentication. So that's one of the beauties of this whole scheme, is that the password on the IBM I profile can be set to star none, and therefore you don't have to manage it anymore.
So that means things like password composition rules. What's the effect there? Those are all gone then, right?
Right. They would only be in effect for the handful of profiles that you would leave with a password. Like QSec Offer has to have a password. The operating system doesn't let you set that to star none. So all of those rules would only apply to those user profiles that retain a password. But the vast majority, whoever you decide to participate in SSO, from a user perspective, all of those profiles can have their password set to star none.
Wow. I think just as important is the flip side, where, well, you can, and we strongly suggest that you set the password on your IBM profiles, or the majority of them, to star none. You don't have to. And so there may be a set of users who maybe they're using a handheld device out on the shop floor and it doesn't sign into the network. Well, they can continue to manage a password and to be able to get in with their handheld devices, but when they log in on their workstation and access the IBM, they will never be prompted and it doesn't get used.
Yeah. So sometimes, when I think about that, it's seems like a simple concept, but something's missing here. So what is missing in this whole equation? Because, we started off talking about how Windows AD and the authentication there looks one way, and obviously it's different on the IBM. So what's missing in making this thing work? Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the ticket, the user ID that's in the ticket is your Windows user ID. And very often, the Windows user IDs aren't the same as the IBM user IDs. And even if they are the same, it's really not a good idea to assume that whatever user ID is in the whatever the Windows user ID is the same person as is represented by a user profile with the same ID. I always use the example of a company that has two people named Johnson, last name Johnson. If the user ID is Johnson in Windows, there's some possibility that Johnson on the IBM represents the other person. And so regardless of whether or not your IDs are the same, or you're like most organizations and they're not, the issue now becomes the IBM knows that you are who you claim to be, but it doesn't know which profile on the IBM represents you.
So that brings us to the next topic, Pat. Since you're the modern father of this, let's talk about enterprise identity mapping, EIM.
Thanks. I'm getting to that age where most people don't refer to me as modern, but I appreciate it. So that's where this other thing comes in called EIM, or enterprise identity mapping. Now, for a lot of reasons, none of which are really good or valid, a lot of people think that EIM is single sign-on, and it's not. It's one piece of it. But EIM is not involved in authentication. What EIM does, it allows you to keep track of the people in your organizations and the user IDs that represent them in different places. In addition, not only does it allow you to keep track of it, but it allows the system to ask EIM the question, given this known and trusted Windows user ID, which user ID represents the same person on my system? And then EIM returns that information and then starts the connection under the ID returned by EIM. And once the system knows what your local user profile is, all the code in the rest of the system is exactly the same as it is if you would have authenticated with a actual profile and password.
Interesting. So let's talk a little bit about enabling SSO on the IBM I. And of course, this thing that we just brought up called EIM is going to come into play here. So to enable SSO on an IBM I, Carol, why don't you guide us through this?
So There's a few steps that have to be done to enable SSO to work with IBMI. So the first thing that you have to do is basically your IBMI has to join the Kerberos realm. That is really what allows IBMI to use or consume one of those Kerberos tickets when it's presented with one. Otherwise, it wouldn't know what to do with it. It wouldn't be able to go back and check to make sure it was valid. So it has to be able to participate in this Kerberos realm. Now remember, Pat already said that when you're joining or you're signing into a Windows network, you're already using Kerberos. So we're not talking about setting up Kerberos. What we're talking about here is making sure your IBMI can participate in Kerberos that you're already doing. So then you have to configure EIM, the Enterprise Identity Mapping, to map your Kerberos identifiers to your IBMI profiles. That's what Pat was talking about in the last couple charts, is that, you know, that ticket contains the AD name, but who is it on IBMI? So you have to do that mapping to tell EIM, hey, when you see this user, Windows user, map to this IBMI user profile. And then finally, we have to change the clients. You can see that depicted by the IBMI Access Client Solutions little graphic there. We have to tell the ACS to use Kerberos instead of a password. So there's a lot of options. If you've ever modified your ACS settings, it will say use prompt once or prompt every time. Those are for passwords, but you have to tell it for the authentication mechanism to use Kerberos. So it's those three steps. Now there's, you know, those are the three basic areas. There's multiple steps within each of those steps, but that's the flow of what has to happen to be able to configure and use SSO.
Pat, any other comments there?
Well, I would just, in those three steps that Carol talked about, you can change the word Kerberos to Windows domain, and it means exactly the same thing. So in effect, what you do when you set this up is you're joining your IBMI to your Windows domain. Of course, you can only join it for purposes of authentication. You can't use the rest of the system management stuff that you can do in a Windows domain for Windows workstations. But in effect, we are joining the IBMI to the Windows domain.
Okay. So, Carol, you brought up ACS a little bit ago. And describe what's going on here in this slide.
Yeah, so I've just shown how you can launch ACS and then basically gone into the system configuration setting. And you can, and usually while we are helping people set this up, we will just kind of do a proof of concept using the 5250 emulation session. What you can do once you know that things are configured properly, you can go in and say every connection through ACS is going to use Kerberos rather than a password. So it's very easy to come in and just say by default, use Kerberos. And that will then assure that every connection made through any kind of interface through ACS will use that Kerberos ticket for authentication rather than prompt you for a user ID and password.
So the last statement there, it's not all or nothing. Can be configured for all or some users. So what you're really showing in this picture is configuring it for an individual user. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so again, from a rollout perspective, a lot of people have found using ACS a lot easier to manage for multiple users across your entire organization. So you can, if you want to, push this out for all of your users. But as Pat alluded to a few slides ago, this is not all or nothing. So again, as we are helping people, we will roll this out for a handful of people and just make sure that it's working properly. And then, people can start a slow roll out across their organization if they want to. Or perhaps there are some users that have to retain a password. like Pat was talking about, an RF device. Maybe those still, maybe the client software there doesn't work with a Kerberos ticket, or it never joins a Windows domain. That's okay. There may be certain instances that users don't use Kerberos for authentication, and that is not a problem. It can be across your entire organization, or it can be a subset. It all works. So, and the reason we emphasize this is that we talk to a number of people and they will bring up instances, well, this set of users can do this, so I can't do SSO. And it's like, no, that's not the case. This is not all or nothing. It can be some users, it can be all users, or anything in between.
Pat, any other thoughts there, or just should we keep rolling?
I got nothing.
All right. I'm going to talk just for a few moments about something that we have here at HelpSystems. We have HelpSystems Single Sign-On Managed Service. It's an implementation and subscription model where we actually help you with the configuration of your Windows-based workstations in the IBM I. We do implementation and training with one of our team. We actually have a team of people who do SSO now because it's become so popular. And then the subscription includes a couple of different things. First of all, it allows you to have access to us directly to update any SSO configurations that you might have that for whatever reason, maybe a new version of the operating system comes out and it stops working and you need some help to get up and running very quickly. We can help you with that. Maybe you would also like to do an annual review of your SSO implementation to see what else you can do with that. And then the final piece that we're starting to include now with our SSO managed service is a bot. One of the big things, it's a robotic process automation bot using our Automate tool here at HelpSystems. One of the big things is if I have a environment where a number of people are moving, onboarding and offboarding, like you have people quit or people resign and then other people are hired in, you're constantly having some flux in your Windows Active Directory and also in the EIM association table. So you need to manage that EIM association table. Before this bot came along, it was a very manual process. That was something you'd have to do piece by piece during the entire SSO implementation, and you'd have to actually manually do that. Well, we've created a bot that automatically takes care of the onboarding and offboarding of people into the EIM association table. So that's something that you can set to run as often as you want or as little as you want, and it just does it for you, so you don't have to worry about that manual process anymore. So altogether, that configuration of and the implementation and training and the bot all are packaged together to create an SSO managed service that we offer here at HelpSystems. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Ian, and we can go into some questions and answers. Ian.
Great, thanks. Anybody in the audience who does have a question can send it in using the Q&A panel, which is on the lower right frame of the screen. Select to send to all presenters. Again, questions for the presenters go into the Q&A panel, right frame of the screen, and select to send to all presenters. John and panel, this first question is, isn't password synchronization the same as SSO?
Pat, you run across this all the time.
Yeah. SSO is a very nebulous term, and it's vague, it's not very well defined. But if you focus on the term single in there, when you do password synchronization, you still have multiple passwords to manage. Somebody's managing that, and if you do it with software, then the cost of managing the multiple passwords is just shifted to the IT department instead of spread across each individual user. So I would say that no, that's not single sign-on, because you're not relying or because you have multiple user IDs and passwords that need to be managed.
Okay, again, folks, send in questions, Q&A panel, bottom right of the screen, select to send to all panelists. There are some questions about the recording. The recording will be available from tomorrow. I will send out an email to everybody who registered for this event when that's available. It should be ready before lunch tomorrow. This next question is, we have situations where a person has more than one account on a given IBM LPAR. When they do one type of work, they use account number 1. When doing other types of work, they use account number 2. How would we deploy SSO for them on that LPAR?
Okay, this is Pat, by the way, and we do run into that situation from time to time, and what it requires a little bit of development on your part. You can do it with a initial program, for example, and I won't get into all of the details, but essentially what the initial program does is it has the user provide their Windows ID and password, and then it verifies that against Active Directory. And once we know who the user is in Active Directory, we can look in EIM and find out all of the IDs that represent them on a particular system. Then you put up a window with each of those IDs, and they just select which one they want to be this time when they log in. Again, that's not really part of our base subscription. There's some consulting that you would need to set that up, but it is something that can be handled.
All right. Do you still need to sign in with a password on the Windows domain to generate a Kerberos ticket?
Yes.
That's easy enough.
Yeah, I would say for me, the interesting thing about that is that your password never has to flow across the network, even on that initial sign-on. Because of the way Kerberos works and because of the tickets, that password is actually used on the ticket that gets returned from the domain controller or the key distribution center in Kerberos speak. And if that password isn't the same one that the domain controller or Active Directory thinks it is, then you won't be able to decrypt that ticket. And if you can't successfully decrypt that ticket, it's not useful for you to get into any other system.
All right, everybody. Q&A panel is on the right frame of the screen. Select to send to all panelists. We do have quite a bit of time, so if you do have a question, send it in now. There's a request to talk again about the all or nothing part of Kerberos. Can you amplify a bit on that?
Yeah, again, it is not something. We have some people that have, again, enumerated certain situations where they've identified that users are either using clients that cannot consume a Kerberos ticket, like on ACS, you get the option to say authenticate via Kerberos, and maybe they have a third-party application where they not just sign on to IBM I, but they also then sign on again, and they want to have to retain that password. That's okay. So the nice thing is that some of your users can participate with this, and others don't have to. It's totally up to you which users you put in that EIM mapping table to match from the Windows Active Directory into your IBM I profile. And so it's totally up to you. Some are all. So.
Yeah, and not only is it some users can and some users don't have to, but for those users that don't have to, they can also use it for some interfaces, but they don't have to use it for all interfaces.
This might be a related question. The utilize single sign-on doesn't do all your applications have to have Kerberos as an option?
Yeah, and the answer would be no, but you may not be able to eliminate passwords depending on the details of the application that doesn't support Kerberos. Now, if it's a green screen application and you just run it after you sign on to the system, then those applications don't have to support Kerberos because the system does the authentication. By the time the application is running, it is built and looks the exact same as if the person had actually authenticated to the system with a profile and password.
Okay, I think I understand this question. Let's give it a try. For some reason, if the Windows network goes down, if it crashes, if a user needed access to the eye, what would that look like if the user had to authenticate? If SEP and Kerberos and password was star none?
Right. So there are a couple of ways to mitigate that potential problem. The one I suggest is if you feel that that's a big enough potential problem and that it will last long enough, that you get a password synchronization tool that allows you to just reset passwords. And if it ever needs to, people sign up for it. And if you ever need to give yourself a password again because of something like this, they can go into that tool and set their password and then still sign on with the ID and password.
Okay, is it possible to connect to a shared folder through single sign-on?
Yes.
Absolutely.
All right.
So NetServer supports single sign-on.
All right. Does it work with RDI and HelpSystems SQL?
Definitely works with HelpSystems SQL, and I believe, although I don't have any direct experience, that the latest releases of RDI do support Kerberos. I could be wrong on that, but I think it does. For a long time, it didn't.
All right. There's a question about using this through another HelpSystems app. Does a robot? Can you use Kerberos using robot?
I don't think robot requires authentication, does it? So,
Well,
you know,
if you're scheduling jobs, if they're talking about the jobs, if you're using the job scheduler, and they're talking about can use Kerberos with jobs that are submitted by robot, the answer is if needed, and it would only be needed if the user ID under which the job was running needed to access something in Windows. If needed, there is a mechanism that can be used to let those jobs access stuff using Kerberos on Windows. We don't run into that very often, but there is a way to do it if it's needed.
Looks like these robot questions are about coming in via the GUI.
I'm not sure if it's supported or not. We'd have to try that.
Yeah.
Okay. EIM, does that require an IBM I license?
Well, it doesn't require an additional license. It comes as part of the base operating system. It doesn't have to run on the IBM I, but certainly if you have an IBM I, it makes the most sense to run it there because it's based on the IBM Tivoli directory server or LDAP server, and that comes for free on the IBM I, where it's a separate product on the other platforms.
This person says, normally when I open an ACS session, I see a sign-on screen. What happens if I open the session using the SSO?
You won't see a sign-on screen?
Figured that was the answer.
All you'll see is your initial menu or application screen.
Right. So if you're opening run SQL scripts instead of being prompted for your user ID and password, you'd go directly into run SQL scripts, and the connection to the database would be made for you without that prompt.
Okay. As an admin, I may sign in with my ID, but may have to log in as QSEC offer for other tasks. How would I change IDs if Windows is controlling the ticket? Did they have to log in and out of Windows?
No. What I would do is, let's assume that they happen to have icons on their screen. I would just have one icon that I use for SSO, and then one icon that is set up to still put up the sign-on screen.
All right, there are a couple questions for like suggestive readings, things that they should go to next. That is just, I guess, a general question. If you want to think about that, we can include it in a follow-up email. Does SSO work with a website running on my IBM I?
I didn't get. Could you repeat that question? I didn't.
Sure. Does SSO work with a website running on my IBM I?
Yes, it does. How much work you have to do to enable it depends on whether or not your web application, because it's enabled per web application, and it depends if your web application utilizes form-based authentication or if it just relies on the web server to do the authentication. It's actually a pretty quick, simple configuration change if you're relying on the web server to do the authentication. But if you're using form-based authentication, which essentially just means that the application puts up a browser window, not a pop-up screen, but a browser window that has the ID and password fields. And then when you click submit, the ID and password goes to the application, the web server doesn't get it and do the authentication. That's called form-based authentication. If your application does that, then either the application has to have an alternative configuration that supports authentication. The Profound UI has an alternative configuration that does that, or you'd actually have to make some application changes.
Okay, this Q&A file is quite lengthy. I think that I've gotten to all of them that are current. John, you can correct me if I'm wrong. If you have some final questions, send them in now. While we're waiting for final questions, I will repeat that we do have a recording of this that we're recording right now. Just have to render the video and then send it out to everybody. It should be in your inboxes tomorrow morning at the latest, at the same time, in the same place rather. You'll have access to the PDF that they presented from today. Any final questions? Yes, there are. This customer is using IBM Hats to render a 5250 session with an Apache server. Will that work with the setup?
Hats does support Kerberos authentication. It has its own application-specific configuration option, but it does support Kerberos.
Okay.
Ian, there's a question about what about replicating domain information between production machine and CBU? Pat, I don't know what that means, but
yeah, I'm not sure what CBU means. I'm assuming it means backup, and I'm assuming CBU. Is that a Windows question or an IBM I question? So if you're talking about EIM domain, then there are HA strategies that you can use for that. There's a couple of different strategies, and it really depends on what your current HA strategy is and how you implement that strategy. But if it's EIM information you're talking about, you do want to address the HA strategy because you don't want to have a separate EIM domain on every partition that you have. You want to manage that in a central location, even if you're replicating that information one way or another. So that's one of the things we address in our
Service.
SSO subscription.
John, I'm not seeing any more.
Nope,
Are you?
I am not either. So
Just one last glance. Bear with me for a second. I think we answered everything. If we didn't, oh, here's one. This is a follow-up question from the question about multiple accounts. How does the initial router connection between ACS and IBMI use the correct IBMI account based upon the initial program that is yet to be called?
So there are a couple of different strategies for that also. One strategy is that using the exit point program and putting up a window that asks for the person's Windows ID and password, then they're actually not using Kerberos to get onto the system, or may not actually be using Kerberos to get onto the system. Or what we often do is we actually have another ID profile for those users on the IBMI, or we pick one of them to be the default profile that gets mapped to. And then when you put up the window and they decide which person they want to be this time, then we either swap to that user ID, or we actually can call Telnet in a way that it will start under the profile that's selected without having to give a password for it. I'm skipping over the details because there's using Kerberos stuff that you're not familiar with, but that's kind of the strategy that we use.
Okay. Patrick, Carol, John, thank you very much for a great presentation. And thanks everybody in the audience. This is much better participation than we normally see over these lunchtime things. I think we probably had a record for a number of questions from the audience. So we do appreciate that. And it certainly makes it worthwhile for everybody to participate. There were questions about handouts and a question about replay. Again, that'll be available tomorrow. And I will just send an email to everybody's registered email address once that's available. John, Carol, and Pat, thank you very much.
thank you.
How did it?
Thank you.